Mrs. Mills here. Thought I'd do a little bit of reading for you, carry on with our wrinkle in time, on to the next chapter. I thought I'd do it outside in my garden, because even though we had a bit of a horrible week last week with a lot of rain, this week started to get glorious again, and today's been particularly beautiful. So I hope you've been out in your garden, or have been out with your parents and things on a walk or a bike ride, getting that hour of exercise and definitely soaking up all this lovely vitamin D that the sun gives you. It's very, very good for you. Also makes you feel really, really happy. So I'm fortunate that I do have a garden. Some of you would have seen a few pictures of it when I did the staff video and things, but I thought as I was out here, I'd have the opportunity to actually show you around a little bit. So these doors here go into my kitchen. These ones over here go into my living room. And as we walk around, I've got a bit of a patio area, you could probably see behind me there, with a chair that only gets the sun at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So I come and sit in my garden at 3 o'clock because I like sitting in the sunshine. And then I've been doing lots of planting. Some of you have seen pictures of those. So I'm going to show you here now. We've got some different things here. We've got some strawberries. Hold the camera a bit better so you can actually see what's going on. Some strawberries. We've got some tomatoes. We've got a courgette, we've got some lavender, we've got some different herbs and things like that. As you can see, I've got my love of owls going on in the garden here. Maybe you can count and let me know how many owls you think I might have in my garden. There are quite a few, many more to come. And yeah, we've got my little barbecue over there. It's not a really big garden, it's just big enough, which is really, really lovely. Just perfect for me. I'm not a really brilliant gardener, but I do okay. Right then, so we're going to read the next chapter of our book. So I'm out here with my cup of tea. I'm going to pop this down over here so that you can see me, hopefully. Does that work? Let's have a look. See. Does that balance? Did I get it right? Did I get it right? Ooh. Let me see. Just about how we're doing. Yeah, then that'll be good. Okay, move my cup of tea over here, my grumpy cat mug. And my cat isn't always grumpy, but sometimes is. Right then, so we're going to go on to the next chapter of our book, which is chapter 5, which is called The Tesseract. So if you remember in the last chapter, then chapter 4, the children were introduced to the dark thing. And we were a bit worried and said that actually, was that something that Meg's father was fighting? Is that the reason why they have been brought there? And we think it probably is. Okay, so this is where we're going to learn a little bit more about the Tesseract. So we're going to read, let's see, about halfway through, I think, the chapter. Let's have a look. Chapter 7. Really coming through this book really, really well. I hope you're enjoying it. As soon as you finish reading it, maybe you can try and get hold of the film. I know some of you watched the film already, but it'd be good to read the book first before you see that film. You know how I feel about things like that. Right, so let's get started. Hopefully you're all ready and you've got your book to read as well. So, the Tesseract. Yes, Mrs. Witch said. He is behind the darkness so that even we cannot see him. Meg began to cry, to sob aloud. Through her tears she could see Charles Wallace standing there, very small, very white. Calvin put his arms around her, but she shuddered and broke away sobbing wildly. Then she was enfolded in the great wings of Mrs. Watson, and she felt comfort and strength pouring through her. Mrs. Watson was not speaking aloud, and yet through the wings Meg understood words. My child, do not despair. Do you think we would have brought you here if there were no hope? We are asking you to do a difficult thing, but we are confident that you can do it. Your father needs help, he needs courage, and for his children he may be able to do what he cannot do for himself. Now, Mrs. Watch said, are we ready? Where are we going? Calvin asked. Again, Meg felt an actual physical tingling with fear as Mrs. Witch spoke. We must go behind the shadow. But we will not do it all at once, Mrs. Watson comforted them. We will do it in short stages. She looked at Meg. Now we will Tessa. We will wrinkle again. Do you understand? No, Meg said flatly. Mrs. Watson sighed. Explanations are not easy when they are about things for which your civilization still has no words. Calvin talked about travelling at the speed of light. You understand that, little Meg? Yes, Meg nodded. That, of course, is the impractical long way round. We have learned to take shortcuts wherever possible. Sort of like in math, Meg asked. Like in math, Mrs. Watson looked over at Mrs. Who. take your skirt and show them. L'experiencia es la madre de la ciencia. Spanish, my dears. Cervantes. Experience is the mother of knowledge. Mrs. Who took a portion of a white robe in her hands and held it tight. You see, Mrs. Watson said, if a very small insect were to move from the section of skirt in Mrs. Who's right hand to that in her left hand, it would be quite a long walk for him if he had to walk straight across. I've got a little diagram in here that I'll show you in a moment. Swiftly, Mrs. Who brought her hand, still holding the skirt, together. So she had it laid out flat like that, and then she brought them together like that. Now you see, Mrs. Watson said, he would be there without that long trip. This is how we travel. So we can see here, and actually, as a class, we did have a conversation about time travel, and we talked about the Back to the Future movies and things like that, about how if you travel in a straight line, it can take a longer time to get there, whereas if you manage to fold time and put it together like that, you would be there instantaneously. You wouldn't have to walk that line. It wouldn't be there. Charles Wallace accepted the explanation serenely, which means calmly. Even Calvin did not seem perturbed. Oh dear, Meg sighed. I guess I am a moron. I just don't get it. That is because you think of space only in 3 dimensions, Mrs. Watson told her. We travel in the 5th dimension. This is something you can understand, Meg. Don't be afraid to try. Was your mother able to explain a tesseract to you? Well, she never did, Meg said. She got so upset about it. Why, Mrs. Watson? She said it had something to do with her and father. It was a concept they were playing with, Mrs. Watson said, going beyond the 4th dimension to the 5th. Did your mother explain it to you, Charles? Well, yes, Charles looked a little embarrassed. Please don't be hurt, Meg. I just kept at her while you were at school until I got it out of her. Meg sighed. Just explain it to me. Okay, Charles said. What is the first dimension? Well, a line. Okay, and the second dimension? Well, you'd square the line. A flat square would be in a second dimension, like a 2D shape. And the third, well, you'd square the second dimension, then the square wouldn't be flat anymore. It would have a bottom, a sides, and a top, like a 3D shape. Who can tell me what 3D shape a square turns into? A cube. Thank you very much. Just like that. A cube. And the fourth, well, I guess if you want to put it into mathematical terms, you'd square the square. But you can't take a pencil and draw it the way you can the first 3. I know it's got something to do with Einstein and time. I guess maybe you could call the 4th dimension time? That's right, Charles said. Good girl. Okay, then for the 5th dimension, you'd square the 4th, wouldn't you? Well, I guess so. Well, the 5th dimension's a tesseract. You add that to the other 4 dimensions and you can travel through space without having to go the long way round. In other words, to put it into Euclid, or old-fashioned plain geometry, a straight line is not the shortest distance between 2 points. For a brief, illuminating second, Meg's face had the listening, probing expression that was so often seen on Charles's. I see, she cried. I got it. For just a moment, I got it. I can't possibly explain it now, but there for a second, I saw it. She turned excitedly to Calvin. Did you get it? He nodded. Enough. I don't understand it the way Charles Wallace does, but enough to get the idea. So now we go, Mrs. Witch said. There is not all the time in the world. Could we hold hands, Meg asked. Calvin took her hand and held it tightly in his. You can try, Mrs. Watson said, though I'm not sure how it will work. You see, though we travel together, we travel alone. We will go first and take you afterwards in the backwash. That might be easier for you. As she spoke, the great white body began to waver, the wings to dissolve into mist. Mrs. Who seemed to evaporate until there was nothing but the glasses, and then the glasses, too, disappeared. It reminded Meg of the Cheshire Cat. I've often seen a face without glasses, she thought, but glasses without a face. I wonder if I go that way, too. First me and then my glasses. She looked over at Mrs. Witch. Mrs. Witch was there, and then she wasn't. There was a gust of wind and a great thrust and a sharp shattering as she was shoved through. What? Then darkness. Silence. Nothingness. If Calvin was still holding her hand, she could not feel it, but this time she was prepared for the sudden and complete dissolution of her body. When she felt the tingling coming back to her, back to her fingertips, she knew that this journey was almost over, and she could feel again the pressure of Calvin's hand about hers. Without warning, coming as a complete and unexpected shock, she felt a pressure she'd never imagined, as though she was being completely flattened out by an enormous steamroller. This was far worse than the nothingness had been. Whilst she was nothing, there was no need to breathe, but now her lungs were squeezed together so that although she was dying for want of air, there was no way for her lungs to expand and contract, to take in the air that she must have to stay alive. This was completely different from the thinning of the atmosphere. When they flew up the mountain, she had to put the flowers to her face to breathe. She tried to gasp, but a paper doll can't gasp. She thought she was trying to think, but her flattened out mind was unable to function as her lungs. Her thoughts were squashed along with the rest of her. Her heart tried to beat. It gave a knife-like sideways movement, but it could not expand. It was as if she's become 2D and she's become flat. So when you breathe, your lungs expand and get bigger and fill with air, and then contract and go back in again. Well, if you're 2D or flat, you can't expand and get bigger. So she's not able to get that breath into her lungs. But then she seemed to hear a voice, or if not a voice, at least words. Words flattened out like printed words on paper. "Oh no, we can't stop here. This is a two-dimensional planet and the children can't manage here." She was whizzed into nothingness again, and nothingness was wonderful. She did not mind that she could not feel Calvin's hand, that she could not see or feel or be. The relief from the intolerable pressure was all she needed. Then the tingling began to come back to her fingers, her toes. She could feel Calvin holding her tightly. Her heart beat regularly. Blood coursed through her veins. Whatever had happened, whatever mistake had been made, it was over now. She thought she heard Charles Wallace saying his words round and full as spoken words ought to be. "Really, Mrs. Witch? You might have killed us." This time she was pushed out of the frightening fifth dimension with a sudden, immediate jerk. There she was, herself again, standing with Calvin beside her, holding on to her hand for dear life, and Charles Wallace in front of her, looking indignant. Mrs. Watson, Mrs. Who, and Mrs. Witch were not visible, but she knew that they were there. The fact of their presence was strong about her. "Children, I apologise," came Mrs. Witch's voice. "Now, Charles, calm down," Mrs. Watson said, appearing not as the great and beautiful beast she had been when they last saw her, but in a familiar, wild garb of shawls and scarves and the old tramp's coat and hat. "You know how difficult it is for her to materialise? If you are not substantial yourself, it's very difficult to realise how limiting protoplasm is." "I am sorry," Mrs. Witch's voice came again, but there was more than a hint of amusement in it. "It is not funny," Charles Wallace gave a childish stamp of his foot. Mrs. Who's glasses shone out, and the rest of her appeared more slowly behind them. "We are such stuff as dreams are made of," she smiled broadly. "Prospero in the Tempest. I do like that play." "You didn't do it on purpose?" Charles demanded. "Oh, my darling, of course not," Mrs. Watson said quickly. "It was just a very understandable mistake. It's very difficult for Mrs. Witch to think in a corporal way. She wouldn't hurt you deliberately, you know that. And it's really a very pleasant little planet and rather amusing to be flat. We always enjoy our visits there." "Where are we now?" Charles Wallace demanded. "And why?" "In Orion's belt. We have a friend here and we want you to have a look at your own planet." "When are we going home?" Meg asked anxiously. "What about Mother? What about the twins? They'll be terribly worried about us. When we didn't come in at bedtime, well, Mother must be frantic by now. She and the twins and four would have been looking and looking for us. Of course, we aren't to be found." "Now, don't worry, my pet," Mrs. Watson said cheerfully. "We took care of that before we left. Your mother has had enough to worry her and you and Charles to cope with. And not knowing about your father without adding to her anxieties, we took a time wrinkle as well as a space wrinkle. It's very easy to do if you know how." "What do you mean?" Meg asked plaintively. "Please, Mrs. Watson, it's all so confusing." "Just relax and don't worry over things that needn't trouble you," Mrs. Watson said. "We made a nice, tidy little time, Tessa, and unless something goes terribly wrong, we'll have you back about 5 minutes before you left. So there'll be time to spare and no one will ever need to know that you were gone at all. Though, of course, you'll be telling your mother, dear lamb, that she is, and if something goes terribly wrong, it won't matter whether we ever get back at all." "Don't frighten them," Mrs. Witch's voice came. "Are you losing faith?" "Oh, no, I'm not." But Meg thought her voice sounded a little faint. I mean, she's a little unsure. "I hope this is a nice planet," Calvin said. "We can't see much of it. Does it ever clear up?" Meg looked around her, realising that she had been so breathless from the journey and the stop on the two-dimensional planet that she'd not noticed her surroundings. And perhaps this was not very surprising, for the main thing about the surroundings was exactly that they were unnoticeable. They seemed to be standing on some kind of nondescript flat surface. Nondescript means you can't really describe it. The air around them was grey. It was not exactly fog, but she could see nothing through it. Visibility was limited to the nicely definitive bodies of Charles Wallace and Calvin, the rather unbelievable bodies of Mrs. Watson, Mrs. Who, and a faint occasional glimmer that was Mrs. Witch. "Come, children," Mrs. Watson said. "We don't have to go far, and we might as well walk. It will do you good to stretch your legs a little." As they moved through the greyness, Meg caught an occasional glimpse of slag-like rocks, but there were no traces of trees or bushes, nothing but flat ground under their feet, no sign of any vegetation at all. Finally, ahead of them, there loomed what seemed to be a hill of a stone. As they approached it, Meg could see that there was an entrance that led into the deep, dark cavern. "Are we going in there?" she asked nervously. "Don't be afraid," Mrs. Watson said. "It's easier for the happy medium to work within. Oh, you'll like her, children. She's very jolly. If ever I saw her looking unhappy, I'll be very depressed myself. As long as she can laugh, I'm sure everything is going to come out right in the end." "Mrs. Watson," came Mrs. Witch's voice severely, "just because you are very young is no excuse for talking too much." Mrs. Watson looked hurt, but she subsided. "Just how old are you?" Calvin asked her. "Just a moment," Mrs. Watson murmured, and appeared to calculate rapidly on her fingers. She nodded triumphantly. "Exactly." Let me check I got this number right. Oh, it's a really long number. 2,379,100,000. No, got it wrong. 2,379,152,497 years, 8 months and 3 days. That is according to your calendar, of course, which even you know isn't very accurate. She leaned closer to Meg and Calvin and whispered, "It really was a very great honour for me to be chosen for this mission. It's just because of my verbalising and materialising so well, you know. But of course, we can't take any credit for our talents. It's how we use them that counts. And I make far too many mistakes. That's why Mrs. Who and I enjoyed seeing Mrs. Witch make a mistake when she tried to land you on a two-dimensional planet. It was that we were laughing at, not at you. She was laughing at herself, you see. She's actually terribly nice to us younger ones." Meg was listening with such interest to what Mrs. Watt was saying that she hardly noticed that when they went into the cave, the transition from the greyness of her outside to the greyness of the inside was almost unnoticeable. She saw a flickering light ahead and down, and it was toward this that they went. As they drew closer, she realised that it was a fire. "It gets very cold in here," Mrs. Watson said, "so we asked her to have a good bonfire going for you." As they approached the fire, they could see a dark shadow against it, and as they went closer still, they could see that the shadow was a woman. She wore a turban of beautiful pale mauve silk and a long, flowing purple satin gown. In her hands was a crystal ball into which she was gazing rapidly. She did not appear to see the children, Mrs. Watson, Mrs. Who, and Mrs. Witch, but continued to stare into the crystal ball, and as she stared, she began to laugh. And she laughed and laughed at whatever it was that she was seeing. Mrs. Witch's voice ran out clear and strong, echoing against the walls of the cavern, and the words fell with a sonorous clang. "We are here!" The woman looked up from the ball, and when she saw them, she got up and curtsied deeply. Mrs. Watson and Mrs. Who dropped small curtsies in return, and the shimmers seemed to bow slightly. "Oh, medium dear," Mrs. Watson said, "these are the children, Charles Wallace Murray." Charles Wallace bowed. "Margaret Murray." Meg felt that if Mrs. Watson and Mrs. Who had curtsied, she'd ought to also, so she did rather awkwardly. "And Calvin O'Keefe." Calvin bobbed his head. "We want them to see their home planet," Mrs. Watson said. The medium lost the delighted smile that she'd worn till then. "Oh, why must you make me look at unpleasant things when there are so many delightful ones to see?" Again, Mrs. Witch's voice reverberated through the cave. "There will no longer be so many pleasant things to look at if responsible people do not do something about the unpleasant ones." The medium sighed and held the ball high. "Look, children," Mrs. Watson said, "look into the well. Que la terre est petite et que le voit dessous de l'île. How small is the earth to him who looks from heaven," Mrs. Who intoned musically. Meg looked into the crystal ball, at first with caution, then with increasing eagerness, as she seemed to see an enormous sweep of dark and empty space, and then the galaxies swinging across it. Finally, they seemed to move in closer on one of the galaxies. "Your own Milky Way," Mrs. Watson whispered to Meg. Right, so we're going to leave it there for now, and we'll find out what more they learn from this medium. So it's a bit of a stop at the moment, having a look at what their galaxy looks like from outer space. Not something we can ever really be able to do, so it's quite a nice opportunity for them, but it must be very important what they are doing. So have a really lovely bank holiday weekend. Do check the website for Mrs. Williams's activities and assembly that she's got on VE Day. We've got cooking pancakes for Mrs. Mills Cook Along on YouTube. Hopefully you got the message about that. Do have a look at that. And then next week we've got the next episode of some Monkston news coming your way as well. So be happy, be safe, and I'll speak to you all again soon. Bye!